Hi folks, my name is Darren Gertis and I review the news on Ukraine daily just to keep you updated and informed about what's going on. Today, as I was looking at the news articles, trying to make sense of it, I generally look for patterns. And as I was looking for a pattern, escalation was the key word that kept coming back to mind, and you'll understand why. When you get to the end of this, you'll understand. So let's start with the first article here, and it's going to be from the Ministry of Defense in Great Britain. They put this out on December 5th, 2022. President Putin signed a law of Russia's federal budget, and so Putin is clearly not thinking about going away quietly into the night. 30% of the entire Russian budget is going to be dedicated now to this war effort. And so I don't think that he's thinking about slowing down. At the same time, here's the ISW talking about an unnamed U.S. defense source told the Times that the Pentagon is no longer insisting that Ukraine should not strike military targets within Russia. That's a big change. That's a significant change. And at the same time, here we have President Putin is risking the loss of support from former proxy republic leaders and veterans due to Russia's forces' failures to push Ukrainians further west of the city of Donetsk and to defend Donbass. They've really been stymied. I mean, since the time that they've adopted for, I don't want to say annexed because I don't want to give them the legal credibility. Since the time that they annexed these regions, they've really made very little, if any, military progress in those regions. So I understand their frustration, but of course it's illegal. So, okay, now here's what's really going on the ground. Today, Ukraine launches a massive missile attack on Russian-occupied Melitopol. Explosions are reported in Donetsk and Crimea as well. So this is what it looks like. Explosions in Melitopol came amid reports from officials on both sides that Ukraine had launched a missile attack on the city, while Russian state media said 20 missiles hit Donetsk People's Republic on Sunday morning. Reports also emerged of multiple explosions in Russian annexed Crimea. So they're taking the fight to the Russians deep within this territory. And when I say deep within this territory, here's what I mean. Like, we don't even think about where Melitopol is, but it's here. I mean, we haven't, I've hardly heard anything of it since like March, because this was just, it was captured very, very early. It was, yeah, so it's deep. Here's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, just for some context. Yeah, let's go back to this. Ukrainian officials have not commented on the explosions in Crimea or the Donetsk People's Republic, and CNN is unable to verify. That's good. When you see reporting that's talking about that they're able to or unable to verify, you can generally have a greater level of trust in the reporting. Here's The Guardian talking about the same thing. Ukraine has attacked the barracks of the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol, with some Ukrainian sources claiming scores of Russian casualties. According to witnesses, 10 explosions were heard, although some of them may have been from anti-aircraft systems. Russia conceded a handful of casualties. That's amazing because that rarely happens. Very often the Russians, their knee-jerk reaction is just lie about the thing. Nothing happened. There was a cigarette that caused a fire. I mean, they say those kind of things. Okay, so again, that's where Melitopol is. Now, at the same time, there's another strike. Ukraine strikes Wagner HQ in Luhansk, governor says. Okay, so what are we talking about? Serhiy Haidai, he's the governor of Luhansk, said a hotel where the group was based in Katowice, Luhansk, region was hit. He added that there were major Russian launches. The Katowice strike, Mr. Haidai said Russia had suffered significant losses, and he expected at least 50% of the surviving forces to die due to a lack of medical treatment. Now, that's really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I'm going to show you on the map where that is. And two, the surviving people dying because they don't get the medical treatment. That's one of the reasons why the kill to wounded ratio is probably a bit higher on the Russian side than it otherwise would have been. I talked about that in the previous video. Okay, so where's Katowice? Katowice is up here. So we had the Melitopol strike today. We had something in Crimea. I'm not exactly sure what that is yet. And then we had Luhansk. So the Ukrainians are on the offense. There's an escalation here where they're taking it to the Russians in a big way. Okay, next. Now there's also this really interesting article here, Ukraine war, millions without powers, Merchant of Death interview, hunt for collaborators. Okay, so I want to start with this first, though. Our enemy is entrenched. This is Medvedev saying this. Our enemy is entrenched in Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. Essentially, he's naming the free world, right? I mean, the republics of the free world, the democracies of the free world, which are in league with sworn allegiance to today's Nazis. So he's calling those people that are democratic states Nazis. This is what the Russians do. They call black white and white black. They're saying whatever they're doing, they call the other side doing that. Okay, let's scroll down a little bit further. Here's what's really interesting. There's a freed arms dealer that was traded for Brittany Griner, and we should never have been doing this. We should never have been trading this guy for her. She's a basketball player. He is an arms dealer called the Merchant of Death. There was a movie made about this guy. He's that bad, right? He praised Putin and backs Moscow's assault on Ukraine, given a damning assessment of the West during his first public interview. Where was his interview? RT. There's a reason why I show you RT and Pravda. Bout said that he kept a portrait of Putin in his prison cell in the United States and said, "I am proud that I'm a proud Russian person and that I'm proud that our president is Putin. I know that we will win." And a little bit further, he said this: "Why did we not do it earlier?" Referring to the decision to invade Ukraine. Like, that's the mentality that's going on here. By the way, remember I was talking about that in league with Nazi bit. Okay, if you want to know, and I've talked about this and talked about this. I created a YouTube short about this where I said, where are the Nazis? And I hashtagged Russia and I hashtagged Putin and trying to lure in as many Russians and pro-Russian types as possible. Show me the Nazis, and they can't. They'll argue with me about, well, it's obvious they're Azov, but they won't actually show me any documentary evidence that the Ukrainian government today is tied to it. There's a statue of Bandera. Yes, because he was a nationalist who didn't like the Soviet oppression of Ukraine. That's why. So you can't show me Nazis. And here's the myth of far-right zealots. This is Euronews. The myth of far-right zealots in Ukraine is Russian propaganda. Please look up this article, or I'll link it down below. However, what I have found is that there are actually neo-Nazi leaning units in Russia's service. So here, a move by Task Force Rush raises fears of rogue paramilitary attacks on Baltic nations of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So this is interesting because these are Russian Nazis. Okay. A neo-Nazi paramilitary group linked to the Kremlin has asked its members to submit intelligence on the border and military activity in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Let's look at the map. Here's Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. I've been to Lithuania and I've been to Belarus. Lithuania borders Belarus, so it doesn't border Russia proper, but that's not really a problem. The Russians use Belarus to invade Ukraine, so that's not an issue. And in fact, I've stood in a place in Vilnius where George W. Bush delivered an address saying, look, the United States is with you, NATO's with you, we have your backs, right? I've stood on the plaque where it is in the capital city. Latvia and Estonia are right on the border with Russia. They share this border. So this is actually a probable point for escalation if these guys go off the rails. And I hope they don't. I hope that does not happen, but I'm just giving you some heads up. Okay, the official Telegram channel for Task Force Rush, currently fighting in Ukraine on behalf of the Kremlin and linked to the notorious Wagner Group. So they're paramilitary related, not Russian soldiers directly. Okay, Rush is closely associated to the Wagner Group. Sources speaking on condition of anonymity said that the Kremlin could lose control of its far-right Russian paramilitary organizations, which may exploit more extreme methods to pursue the Ukrainian war, raising fears of escalation if a NATO state were attacked. Because if they were attacked, an attack on one is an attack on all. I told you about where I stood in Vilnius on that very square on the plaque where George W. Bush gave his speech. I'm telling you, it's possible. I hope it doesn't happen. The real question is, how much control does the Kremlin really have? Now, I gave this one video month and a half ago. He's not really in control like you think he is. Like you think if he just stopped now, he can't stop without losing power, and he will not lose power if he can help it. So he's being pushed by farther hawkish elements within nationalist elements within Russia are pushing him and pushing him. And that's beyond whatever he wanted to do to begin with. So it's in a very, very strange place. Okay. Recent reports indicate Biden administration is now considering designating the Wagner Group a foreign terrorist organization. Well, that's a step forward. I think Russia needs to be designated as a terrorist state, but that'll be at least a step the right direction. Okay, so with that being said, let's go on to the next article. Family horrified by video of sledgehammer killing of Wagner Group defector. So these guys, these related Wagner Group neo-Nazi types, that one of their members, and I'm not actually going to show the article. You can look this up. You can read the title here, pause it, find a title, and read this for yourself. But what they actually did was somebody from the group defected to Ukraine. He was caught later. They killed him by hitting him with a sledgehammer. Like, they videotaped this. So these are not nice guys. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. European Union concerned about Turkey's ties to Russia. Okay. I talked about Erdogan, and he's not really a friend of Ukraine, but he's not really an enemy either. He's self-interested, and follow the interest. If you went back and watched that video when I talked about that, about following the interests, you'll understand that he will do whatever is in his favor and in Turkey's favor. And he's a little bit more like Muslim Brotherhood kind of tied than I would like, but he's helped Ukraine, like with grain, but he's also willing to help Putin wherever his interests lie with Putin. And that's basically the basis of this small little article. In fact, I trust Putin more than I trust Erdogan, because I trust him to do the wrong thing consistently. Erdogan you have to really understand his psychology in order to know where it is. And I'm not saying like Putin's a good guy or anything. I just trust him to reflexively do wrong. Okay, next. Putin, on the other hand, has to escalate in order to survive. And that's why we're talking about escalation. He has to escalate. He cannot win just by being nice or having a brief peace or whatever. So let's go into this article. The strikes by the newly developed homemade long-range drones, one of them only 150 miles from Moscow. And every commentator worth their salt was pointing out, hey, this strike here at Engels 2, look how close this is to Moscow. I mean, how far from the border? And like, I was doing that, so was everybody else, Jake Bro and everybody else. Okay, are of a different order from the previous attacks in Crimea and other Russian-occupied areas. They take the war to a more expansive, dangerous level and represent the escalation that the NATO allies fear most. NATO does not want to get into a hot war. They're trying not to do it. Putin is trying not to do that by saber rattling with his nukes. Neither side really wants that. The Ukrainians claim self-defense. Putin will see their actions as deeply provocative and will hit back in any way that he can. So yeah, it's within our borders. So now he's going to have to escalate, and he's going to be pushed into doing that. That's why I was pointing that out earlier. NATO's efforts to contain the war inside Ukraine's borders have already failed. You also have Hungary's Viktor Orban, who loves Putin, blocked some funding in the EU the other day. European embassies are coming under physical attack. Remember the eyeballs being sent in packages, this disgusting thing that I don't think we've figured out yet. When Putin warned it would be a long process, now this is a really interesting passage, and this is why I want you to see this. When Putin warned it would be a long process, he was not merely talking about a special military operation, although it could have been that, which, by the way, he called a war. He should be going to jail for that. He called it a war last week. The way he frames the conflict is now a historic, all-encompassing confrontation between Russia plus like-minded authoritarian states versus Western democracies. And it's really amazing who lines up with Russia. It's essentially all authoritarian kind of states. It's those like Russia and China and Venezuela and Belarus and Syria and Iran. Okay. At any rate, let me go down just a little bit further. Many Europeans and nearly half of Americans, 47%, want to see a negotiated peace. Now, there are some that just don't get it. They just, oh, peace, this is terrible. They want peace. Peace is terrible if they get the wrong kind of peace. So what I mean by that is you need to have Putin lose. So many in the justice camp. I'm in the justice camp. I'm not in the just peace at any cost camp. Justice camp call Schultz an appeaser and say such hopes are naive. Ukrainians reject any accommodation. They want Putin tried for war crimes. He should be tried for war crimes. Unless you can make Putin defeated and cry uncle and have to have a peace imposed upon him, you're not getting those 600,000 children back. That's why you have to have this. In a nutshell, this is the immediate, seemingly insurmountable problem obstructing all other schemes and dreams of a benign post-war settlement. Putin's fall is a prerequisite for lasting peace. He has to be militarily defeated on the battlefield, and then you'll have legitimate peace, not just going back to doing, a freezing from 2014 to 2022 and starting again, freezing in 2022 and coming back a few years later. We can't do that. Okay, now there is really interesting discontent in Russia by those hardliners that are pushing Putin to do more. So this is Igor Girkin, and this article here is really fascinating for a whole different reason. This guy, he was in Crimea in 2014, in Donbass in 2014, kind of creating the environment that we have today. Some Russian officers, he's a Russian soldier. Some Russian officers fighting in Ukraine are unhappy with the military top brass and Vladimir Putin because of the poor execution of the war. The influential nationalist Russian blogger said, that's Igor Girkin. Direct public criticism of Putin is rare because you can get 15 years in jail for saying anything against the war. Even calling it the war instead of a special military operation can get you thrown in jail in Russia. So Igor Girkin, a nationalist and former Federal Security Service officer who helped Russia annex Crimea in 2014 and then organize pro-Russian militias in eastern Ukraine, said that the fish head is completely rotten and that Russian military needed reform and intake of competent people who could lead a successful military campaign. And on that, he's right there with the ISW's assessment of where Russia is. They have terrible military procedures. Okay, goes on a little bit further, and he says Putin last week used the word war to describe the conflict. You shouldn't say that. That's a special military operation, but he did. And he said the war started in 2014. Like, this is illegal for most people to say in Russia, but he's saying it. When a pro-Russian president was toppled and Ukraine's Maidan revolution and Russian annexed Crimea and Russian separatists began fighting in eastern Ukraine. Putin cast what he calls Russia's special military operation as a watershed moment in history when Russia finally stood up against the West. And that's the way that he's trying to propagate it. And that's the way that I'm hearing people talk about it more and more in social media. And I'm like, I'm horrified by this. This is why I do what I'm doing here. This is why this channel exists, because like the nonsense is just widespread. The West, Girkin said, wanted to foment a revolutionary situation in Russia akin to the February Revolution in 1917. So World War I, when Tsar Nicholas II abdicated over Russian failures in World War I. So the West is fomenting Ukraine in order to get rid of Putin. But the West wasn't doing this. It's only after Putin invades that this actually became an issue to the West, and the West actually got significantly involved. But that's the kind of propaganda that you're going to see from Russian propaganda points. Okay, we're going to have some fun with Russian state media, so stay tuned. You want to see the third one particularly. You really just, you want to see it. Okay. So the first one, Russia is increasing production of advanced weaponry, says former President Dmitry Medvedev. Moscow is developing arms based on new principles. Well, that's because your previous principles were terrible. Medvedev, who currently serves as the deputy chairman of the Security Council, claimed that Moscow's enemies are not only in Kyiv, but also in Europe, North America, and a number of other locations whose allegiances lie with contemporary Nazis. Like, the guy's just off his rocker. I mean, There's no evidence of this at all, but anybody who's opposed to Russian are full of Russian bias, Russophobes, and Nazis. Therefore, we are increasing the production of the most powerful weapons and munitions, including those based on new principles, he said. Okay. Maria Zakharova warned Washington that should it provide Kyiv with long-range weapons, this would cross a red line and make America a direct party to the conflict. So what she's doing here is she is actually pushing America back from supplying these things. America is being deterred by the lines that the Russians are creating, despite what the Russians are doing, which is genocidal acts of kidnapping children, genocidal acts of destroying the infrastructure so that old women and children are starving in civilian occupied areas. Despite all that, that's what she's doing. Russian President Vladimir Putin noted that virtually all stocks from NATO arsenals were thrown in to support the Kyiv regime. He added that Russian equipment is performing well with a standoff with Western weapons. Okay, wait a minute. Are they performing well, or do we need to develop arms based on new principles? Which is it? And that's really the fascinating thing about Russian propaganda. It can be both, or neither, or I don't know. It's a really fascinating thing. Second article here, EU is getting hooked on U.S. energy. Now, there's not much to the article, but the implication is basically the EU states that to rid themselves of reliance on Russian energy makes them slow to acknowledge that they're dependent on the U.S. And now when the Europeans are spending billions of euros every day, these billions of dollars are being earned in Washington. Well, they're not like going to the U.S. government. They're going to largely American energy companies who are supplying it. But the implication is, see, you're now a slave to the Americans, and that's what they're trying to explain. So, okay, last article. I told you to wait for this one. This one is absolutely amazing. It's this. If the pot is calling the kettle black, here you are. The Polish government is secretly funding a Twitter account notorious for spreading disinformation. Huh? Okay, so RT is complaining about how there is a Twitter account notorious for spreading disinformation. I mean, that's just amazing. Now, they talk about this particular account and that it has so many followers and it has a clear anti-Russian bias, but very much what you see in RT and Pravda and TASS and others, what the Russians say is exactly what they do. Oh, they're spreading disinformation? That's because the Russians are actually spreading disinformation. Okay, that's what's going on. I think we're seeing some significant escalation. I hope it doesn't become something much worse, but it's on. I mean, this is full blown and on. Thank you for your time. Thank you for spending this with me. I know you didn't have to. If you're at this point already, I so deeply appreciate that you're willing to listen to me. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.